Okay, this is Mr. P, back with lesson number 6, which will continue from lesson number 5. So if you haven't watched the first 5 videos, maybe you're watching these in order. So this is lesson number 6, video number 6. We left off discussing Ida B. Wells and her role in resisting lynching. I just want to make sure, if you give me a second, I just want to make sure that this is actually recording. It looks like it is. The last time I recorded, I recorded lesson number 6. It did not record at all. So this is my second take on lesson number 6. All right, so let's get back into it. So we looked at last time at Ida B. Wells's video, her story, her way in which she published Southern Horrors: Lynch Law in All Its Phases as a way to use research. She researched 700 cases of lynching, went and interviewed people at those sites as a way to reveal the true story of lynching. You know, she was just curious, and then once she realized, once her research told her that Black folks were not actually being were committing crimes to get lynched, that mostly those accusations were lies, and sometimes they weren't even accused of crimes, they were simply lynched. She is able to articulate and communicate this important lesson, which is that Black folks were often competing economically with white people, exercising their rights, and lynching was a result of that, both on an individual and a mass scale. We've already kind of realized that, I think, to some degree with our look at Tulsa and Greenwood and things like that. Also, I think I emphasized this in the last video, but I'll re-emphasize it here. Frederick Douglass didn't realize this to be true, right? He believed that, to some degree, that Black folks were committing crimes, and that's why they were being lynched, until Ida B. Wells taught him otherwise. So she was influential in persuading not just, folks who had, she persuaded prominent leaders as well. That's the important point here. So I asked you to pause and read this story. So hopefully you did that and learned more about the role of her research into the Memphis lynching of the People's Grocery. But this video, I want to spend the next, 8-10 minutes discussing Ida B. Wells and what else she did. So you'll notice here an image of Ida B. Wells at the March on Washington in 1913, not the 1963 March on Washington, the 1913 March for women's suffrage. And this is really a fabulous story. She was living in Chicago, in part because she had to move there after Memphis. Some white folks in Memphis threatened her life and burned down her newspaper press. And so she moved to Chicago. She started a Black women's suffrage group there and brought them to this organized march on Washington. And when she got there, she was told to march in the back. For a few reasons we'll get into in a moment. She refused to march in the back. The women she brought did, but she refused. She walked up the sidelines during the parade and came out in the front after the parade had started and walked in the front with the Illinois delegation. You can see here, Illinois, with her state delegation, Illinois here as well, with her state delegation, so that she knew her power, she knew her dignity, and she refused to bend to being told where to walk, right? That is kind of her power. Now, why was she asked to march in the back during this fight for women's suffrage at this march that was trying to persuade Woodrow Wilson to support the 19th Amendment? So this quote will help us with that. This is a quote of her in the Chicago Tribune. The writer says, Mrs. Barnett's voice, right, Barnett Wells, Mrs. Barnett's voice trembled with emotion and 2 large tears coursed their way down, partway down her cheeks before she could raise her veil and wipe them away. These Southern women, Ida B. Wells says, have tried to evade the question time and again by giving some excuse or other every time it's brought up. So she's referring to the question of race and racial solidarity and interracial organizing. If the Illinois women do not take a stand now, right, Illinois in the North, in this great Democratic parade, then the colored women are lost. I shall not march at all unless I can march under the Illinois banner. So Illinois, not Southern women, right? Some, at least the Black women usually would have moved to Chicago from the South. But the white women from Illinois, right, are Northern women. Why would they have told her to march in the back? Well, the reason is twofold. One, the fear that Southern women would not support the movement, Southern white women would not support the movement if Black women were front and center. And Woodrow Wilson being holding racist ideas and views himself, they were scared that he wouldn't support the 19th Amendment if Black women had front and center leadership. So the fears of white kind of supremacist thinking would force Black women to take a back seat. Ida B. Wells refused to take that back seat. Another way in which she refused to bend to Jim Crow, discrimination, segregation, white supremacy, we see in the quote from her daughter here, in her excerpted from her book. Her daughter writes, "Even when there was no segregation in Chicago, there were certain places you didn't go because you knew you wouldn't be treated right. After discrimination intensified, Mother went to Marshall Field's department store. She waited and waited, but no clerk would help her. Finally, she took a pair of men's underpants, put them over her arm, and walked toward the door. Immediately, a floor worker stopped her, and so she was able to buy them. She used to tell about this as a funny incident, Ida B. Wells Barnett with a pair of underpants dangling over her arm. She was only 5'3" or 4", and she had grown plump in her 50s, but she walked as if she owned the world." And that's who Ida B. Wells was, right? She was a woman who knew her power, knew her worth, and went about her business with the full awareness of her dignity, her worth, and her freedom, despite the world not conferring that on her. She conferred it on herself, and her resistance conferred that dignity on her in many ways. Just truly powerful woman and leader at the time. One more example, one of my, probably my favorite example of her resistance to segregation. This is a story, I won't read it word for word right here, the backstory, you can read the italicized if you want to pause and read it in detail. But basically, this is her trip on a train in Tennessee, where she was asked to move to the front where Black folks were kept. And you might wonder, well, front and buses was for white folks. Well, on trains, the front was the Jim Crow car for Black folks, because if a train crashed, the front is the part that would collide with something else, right? Another train or something like that, which was a risk. And so that's where they placed Black people on Jim Crow trains. She refused. She went to the white car and refused to get up. She actually was removed, sued, and ordered to pay, the company was ordered to pay her $500, but the Tennessee Supreme Court overturned that verdict, and she actually ended up having to pay them court fines. Just ridiculous. But let me read you word for word the quote she has here. She says, "I refused, right, to get up out of the white car, saying that the forward car closest to the locomotive was a smoker, and as I was in the ladies' car, I proposed to stay. The conductor tried to drag me out of the seat, but the momentum, he caught hold of my arm. I fastened my teeth in the back of his hand. I had braced my feet against the seat in front and was holding to the back, and as he had already been badly bitten, he didn't try it again by himself. He went forward and got the baggageman and another man to help him. And of course they succeeded in dragging me out. I resisted all the time, never consented to go," right? I just love this story for two reasons. One, she bit the man's hand, right? This was a woman who was not going to give in, willing to take risk, right? We see that time and again. Going to the 700 sites of lynching was extremely dangerous for her. And the other reason I love this is in 1883. She's 20, right? Not that much older than all of you. And she's refusing to get up and out. And this reminds us, right? This is about, what would this be? 16 years after the desegregation of the trolley cars in Philadelphia. Octavius Catto refusing to get up and the trolley car being detached. We also see, right? We see in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks and Claudette Colvin refusing to get up out of the buses. But there's a long history, right? This is, will this be 50, 67, about 70 years before Rosa Parks, this is. So there's a long history of Black folks refusing to get up out of their seats, and she demonstrates the women leadership, just like Octavius Catto's wife. The women leadership in this fight against segregation. Last piece to our resistance to lynching, the NAACP, started by W. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells, and also a few white folks, including Mary Overton. This is a good example of an organization founded by an interracial group of Black and white folks. The white people had the money, right? And so, or certain groups of white folks had the money, and so they needed them. But it's, I like this because it's also an example of how white people took a stand against white supremacy, against lynching, against segregation during this time period. Just like we saw with the 1688 petition in Germantown against slavery, from the very beginning and all throughout, there are white people who are fighting against segregation, fighting against slavery, fighting against, in this case, lynching, fighting against white supremacy in all its manifestations and forms. And we can't lose sight of the importance of that as well. So we see here a march in 1917 from the NAACP against lynching, first mass march organized by Black communities in the United States. We see a flyer here educating people about how many people had been lynched at that time, through that time. It's about 5,000 documented lynchings through the 1950s, but during that time, this is the height of lynchings. And many of the examples are of people being, the crimes people were alleged of doing. The top two were murder and rape. And this flyer takes Ida B. Wells's research and says, these are in many ways made up to justify the lynchings. These people weren't given court trials. They were they were presumed guilty simply because of their Blackness, and because they were competing economically, because they had the dignity to display and the audacity to display that dignity, especially with war veterans, that kind of thing. This also highlights that women were being lynched as well. And so it's just kind of, emphasizing, educating people and calling on people to support, the fight against lynching. They tried to get anti-lynching legislation passed. It does not get passed until a couple years ago. So during the height of lynching, it was not getting passed. So this is just another way in which people fought in an organized fashion against lynching. So that closes out our study of lynching and resistance to it. Next video, video number 7, is going to discuss the Great Migration and the way in which Black people fled that violence, and there were several other causes as well that we'll touch on. And we'll begin studying Black artists during this time period of the Great Migration as well.